Self-storage development step 4, buildings. So right around the time when we were finishing the foundations, the builders had already arrived and were ready to go. The steel was literally being delivered as the foundations were drying, so there was no time to waste. And this was a really exciting time because there was a lot of activity on the site between concrete workers and excavators and building assemblers. It was a pretty crowded place, but it was really cool to see all the people doing their jobs and working around each other. It was late October when the builders got started, and we were told it would take them about 2.5 weeks per building, which would put the finish line right in the middle of December. And the weather started out pretty nice for the first few weeks, but all of a sudden it got really cold, as it usually does around this time of year in Michigan. Something I wasn't aware of until long after this project was designed and well underway was the concept of a fortress design. And this is where you can build your storage facilities so that the backs of your buildings act as a portion of your fence so that you can spend less money on fencing. And that is not how we designed this facility. If we had done the fortress design, this probably could have saved us some money on fencing. Our fence alone is going to cost around $100,000. Although I think one drawback is that if you're going to use your building as part of your fence, the building itself can't be quite as big. Our buildings were 40 feet wide, which allowed us to put doors on both sides of the buildings and have individual units on both sides. I'm not sure if we would have been able to do that if we had gone with the fortress design. If there's any other storage facility owners out there who are using a fortress design, and if you do not like it, feel free to leave a comment below and let me know. I'd just be curious to know what your experience is with that. One thing that I deliberated on really early on in this design process was whether or not to have lights on the inside of some of these units, in particular the 30-foot deep units where it can get a little bit dark deep on the inside. So since I wasn't really sure what to do, I did what I've done many times now in this process, where I took the question to the many self-storage investing Facebook groups out there, and I just ran some polls to find out, what do you think? Should I include interior lights in these units or not? And the response was a pretty overwhelming no to that. Apparently it sounds like a lot of people out there who do have interior lights in these units, what they end up dealing with is tenants who try to steal their electricity, because it's really easy to get these outlets that you can just screw into light bulb sockets and just siphon off as much electricity as you want. And I think there is a way to meter this properly if you actually want to upcharge people for electricity. You can turn on and off the electricity in certain units if you want to go down that route, but I wasn't looking to do that. I just wanted to keep this super simple, and the simplest way to do this thing was just to not have any lights in any of these units. And I can say, now that I've actually been inside these 30-foot deep units, it's not really that dark, especially if you're trying to get in and out of the unit in broad daylight, which is typically going to be the case because this facility is going to be closed at nighttime. It's not really that hard to see around deep in these units, and if you are having issues, pretty much everybody has a flashlight on their phone these days. So that's the route we decided to go with that, and so far I don't regret it, but time will tell if people complain about the lack of light in there. I don't think they will, but we'll see. The company we worked with for these buildings was called Storage Structures out of Georgia. I originally wanted to work with Tracti, but at the time when we were trying to get these buildings designed, Tracti's engineering department was backed up several weeks, and Storage Structures was able to move immediately. And I think the price with Storage Structures ended up coming out a little bit less anyway. I was actually working with some consultants for the first half of this project called S3 Partners. This being my first self-storage development project, I really had no idea what I was doing, and I really needed somebody to stand over my shoulder and make sure I wasn't making any mistakes and help me figure out the right design and the unit mix and the feasibility of the project and all that. And S3 Partners was really helpful at getting me started on the right foot, and they were actually the ones who found Storage Structures and recommended them to me in the first place. I probably never would have found them on my own, but Storage Structures did a pretty good job. The end product that they built was a nice, solid building that I'm sure will serve us well for many years to come. And there was one odd issue where the buildings were actually built backwards, like 180 degrees backwards. And the issue didn't really matter in the end. It just meant that the end cap units, so the smaller 5x10s on one side and the 10x10s on the other side, those basically were just flipped around on the opposite sides. And that wasn't really a big problem. There wasn't like a really strong reason why we put them on one side or the other. So luckily that part didn't end up mattering. But the other issue was the interior walls. So we have 25 feet of space between between the buildings. And on the other ends, there's 30 feet of space on the west side and then 30 feet of space on the east side before it gets into our RV parking area. And the reason that's important is because there are bigger, longer units on those outer areas that have more space. So say if somebody is trying to back in a trailer and fill up a 30-foot deep unit, we don't want them to have only 25 feet of space to do that. We want them to have at least 30 feet, preferably more. But the idea being there should be more room to move around on the sides of those deeper units. And since the buildings were built backwards, it was the other way around, where the 10 and the 15 feet deep units had 30 feet of space. And then the 30 and the 25-foot deep units only had 25 feet of space, if that makes sense. So luckily that could be fixed because the interior walls are movable and they were able to move them around so that, it was eventually corrected. It took a while to get that done, but again, by the time everything was finished, those units were sized correctly on the right sides. It's just kind of an odd communication error that I never thought would have come up. Even to this day, as I'm recording this, I'm a little baffled at what happened there and who dropped the ball. I never really got to the bottom of who should have done what to make sure that everybody was on the same page. And part of the reason why I haven't gotten to the bottom of it is because it doesn't really matter. We were able to resolve everything and make it work. But I guess it was just one of many examples of how communication is something that is so important and it's so easy for it to not happen. If everybody isn't in communication with everyone and hitting reply all on every email and making sure everybody's on the same page, this kind of stuff can and will happen at some point along the way. And this was one example of that in our project here. Now, since this is in Michigan and there are times of the year when we can get a lot of snow, and since these roofs are made of steel, not shingles and wood, flatter roofs are generally more ideal for this type of building because if it's a steeper pitched metal roof, it can allow the snow to slide off in the winter and create more work for snow plowing. So that's why we went with this flatter roof. It's not completely flat, but pretty darn close. And flatter roofs are also a little bit cheaper in the end as well. They don't really have the same aesthetic look as a pitched roof, but I thought they looked pretty decent. These buildings are designed with standing seam roofs, which is important when snow and ice sits on them for long periods of time to keep them from leaking. You'd be a lot more likely to have issues with a screw down roof with screws going through them. Now, originally these buildings were designed with gutters and downspouts, and I kind of decided last minute to remove those and just not have them at all because it would just give me another job to take care of each year, cleaning out gutters, which I really don't enjoy doing. And since there are no basements to these buildings and the drip edge was going to fall down on the concrete, not on gravel or asphalt, the dripping water wouldn't really cause much deterioration to the road or anything like that. And the only real drawback that I've noticed so far is that when it's raining, there's an annoying little drip that will fall right on you as you're trying to get in and out of the units. And this is only an issue if you're trying to get in and out of the units while it's actively raining. Otherwise, it's not really a problem at all. One other thing that kind of caught us off guard when the buildings were mostly finished was we noticed there was this gap between the top of the walls and the ceiling between each unit side by side. And at first when we saw this, we were like, what? We were a little concerned it could be some kind of a security risk because it wouldn't be easy, but if a person was skinny enough and if they really wanted to, it kind of looked like you could crawl between each unit if you could get up there on a ladder. Granted, I don't know how often that ever happens, probably not very often, but even if it doesn't happen, it still visually kind of looks like a security risk. We were just confused, like, why would you intentionally design buildings this way with a big unnecessary gap there? And as we were looking more into it, apparently this is what you want when you're building a climate-controlled facility, because this gives you a lot better airflow and avoiding condensation and that kind of thing. So that totally makes sense if this was going to be a climate-controlled facility, but this was not a climate-controlled facility. From what I could see, it looked like they basically just took the same template from their climate-controlled designs and carried it over to ours, even though we didn't need that. And after looking into this a bit more, turns out there is something you can do to fill in this gap and just not have it be there at all. It's this piece of metal called Rake angles that you can just screw up there and it basically just covers up the gap so that it's not there. So we got a couple different estimates for how much it would cost to fill in that gap and put the rake angles up there. And the cost came out around $12,000 to $15,000 to do this for all four of these buildings. And we were just like, seriously? It would have been nice to know about that up front, but we didn't know about that. Nobody mentioned anything about it, and we didn't even know it was going to be an issue until the buildings were basically done. So if I was doing this over again, I would basically just make sure that when I'm getting the quote from my building company, they're including the rake angles, and I don't have to be surprised by that after the fact. We deliberated about this for a few weeks to try to figure out, is it worth spending 12 to 15 grand just to fill in that little gap, or do we just let it go? And, you know, hopefully people don't care, and hopefully nobody ever tries to crawl between the units that way. And ultimately we decided just to let it go and not worry about it. And time will tell if this ends up being a problem or not. I've heard people do some pretty dumb things when it comes to trying to steal stuff out of units. When I posted this issue in a few self-storage Facebook groups, some people thought it was just completely unacceptable and crazy that it would be designed this way. Other people were like, this is no problem at all. Like, ours have this and it's never been an issue. I heard stories from other facility owners where people would try to disassemble the wall altogether to try to steal stuff out of the unit next door. So apparently, like, there's really no way to stop somebody from stealing something if they really want to do it. But this is one of those things where it's like, if you can eliminate a potential perceived security risk, why not do that? You know, I mean, I get it if this is a climate-controlled facility, but it's not. I mean, there's really no reason this should be there. And I'm just crossing my fingers and hoping and praying it never ends up being an issue, because if it does, and if we ever do try to put these rake angles up there retroactively, it's going to be a lot harder to do this when all of the units are occupied. And frankly, I just don't know that we ever will, because it'll be such a hassle. So again, if I was doing this over again, I would get those rake angles installed, and I would make sure that it was priced into my original quote so that I was fully aware of what the total cost would end up being. Another thing we had to deal with in the design stage was following our local building code. And this is a thing in many places around the country, but we had to put a few firewalls into each building, which initially seemed pretty dumb and unnecessary because these buildings are all steel with no combustible materials like wood that could catch on fire. And in order to put these firewalls in each building, it was going to cost us tens of thousands of dollars to do it. It's basically 2 layers of drywall on each side of the wall with metal studs between them, so 4 layers altogether to make the full wall on both sides, and then fireproof caulk around the seams, and then a sheet of metal over both sides, with the idea being, if a fire ever starts at one end of the building or the other, that fire can only go so far before it hits the firewall and stops, so it won't burn everything up. And after reading into this a little bit more to try to understand, like, why is this something we need to think about with a concrete and steel building? And the issue with fire isn't the buildings themselves. It's actually more because we don't know what people are going to be storing in these units. Say, for example, if somebody was storing a car that had a full fuel tank, or furniture that is highly combustible, or I don't know, buckets of rocket fuel that was just completely exposed, any of that stuff could start on fire. And so this code is meant to protect against any of those potential fire threats. Even though the building itself probably wouldn't burn very easily, who knows what people are storing in there. So even though it's definitely annoying, and I'm certainly not a fan of the huge extra cost we had to pay for that, in the end, I understand. So the final and one of the most important components of these buildings were the doors. And the doors were actually made by a completely separate company. Storage Structures at the time of this recording doesn't make doors, so we ended up working with a company called TrackRite, which is owned by Tracti, and we had the doors installed by a local subcontractor. And getting the doors on was definitely a faster, less involved process, but it did have its own little set of surprises and unexpected challenges to work through. And that's what I'll be diving into in the next video. So be sure to tune in for that, and I'll see you there.